The factory entries quickly catch the tail end of the field. With the track ahead of him looking like a parking lot, Parnelli doesn't even think about shutting down.
Now, I don't know about you, but when I watch a movie, I tend not to watch the second half before the first half. So if you're watching this video and you have not yet seen part 1 of this story, then basically you are watching the second half of the movie before the first. So I recommend you go back and watch part 1 first, because there's a lot of crossover between various cars. Now hopefully, if I've done the magic thing, a link will appear somewhere up here. So 9 down and 7 to go, plus the bonus car, which I'll get to at the end. Now the first 9 cars were all built in late 1968 and early 1969. And then for 1970, Ford dropped to a single car factory entry, and so Bud Moore Engineering got the gig. Now BME prepared 3 cars for the 1970 season, and these were all 1969 models that had been updated. And they were all painted school bus yellow, which is actually factory grabber orange. Now there were a few changes to the 1970 Trans-Am regs which impacted the factory Mustangs. First, they were no longer required to fit a factory front spoiler. They could fabricate one from scratch. But it couldn't extend beyond the front bumper, and it could be no wider than the front wheel track centerline. And it couldn't extend more than 4 inches below the bodywork, and from a side profile it had to be as unobtrusive as possible. So basically a flat piece of alloy sheet or Lexan and tilted at an angle. Now Ford hired the Lockheed wind tunnel and did a bunch of testing to get the best front spoiler arrangement. And as you can see from the pictures here, they took a 1969 Shelby Mustang and stuck a 1970 nose on it. This looks to be chassis 073, the Kar-Kraft prototype, which ran in late 1969 as the number 2. And tests showed that by taking the factory rear spoiler and tilting it at full attack mode, it actually balanced out the new front spoiler pretty well. Remember, the factory Boss 302s did not run that factory rear spoiler in 1969. Minimum weight for 1970 increased from 2,900 pounds to 3,200 pounds dry. And only a single 4-barrel carb could now be used, so the BME Mustangs were equipped with a Holly.
Parnelli Jones stands on it right from the start, sprinting away from the field with Mark Donohue directly behind him. Parnelli usually turns his fastest laps during the early going, spurred on by an empty track in front of him and Mark Donohue in his mirror.
Now, Parnelli Jones and George Follmer did all the races in 1970, even though there was still no Drivers' Championship. Ford ended up winning the Manufacturers' Championship, and Jones took 5 victories and Follmer took 1. And the 3 chassis used the VIN numbers 9502M, 212, 775, 776 and 777. And these were delivered to Kar-Kraft in around June of 1969, so they were a later batch of 69 models than the early cars that we featured in part 1. Now, chassis 775 and 776 were supposed to be the 2 main cars, with 777 used as the backup. And these 2 cars used a fancy new 3-link rear suspension setup that Jones didn't much care for. So he drove chassis 777 for most of the season before BME switched 775 back to a 1969 4-link arrangement. Jones drove 775 with its converted suspension in the final 2 races at Kent and Riverside, and he won both of them. The Riverside event was the one where he had the big crash early on in the race, and he made his incredible comeback to win with a smacked up car. And then for 1971, Ford pulled its funding and BME had to go it alone as an independent team. Jones was retained, but he only did the first race before he announced his retirement. Follmer then returned from round 2 onwards. So chassis 775 was driven by Jones in the first race in 1971 and then by Follmer for the next 4 races. And Follmer took 2 victories at Briar and Mid-Ohio. And then it was sold to Omar Garzalale in Mexico, and it raced there for years. But it's since vanished, and all efforts to try and find it have failed, and a lot of people have tried. Now, of all the factory Boss 302 Trans-Am Mustangs, They're either known to still exist, or they're known to have been destroyed in combat. But chassis 775 is the only car whose current fate is unknown. This was Vollmer's main ride for 1970, and he won the Breyer race with it. It finished second 5 times and third twice, so it had a pretty good season. It was then sold to Warren Tope for 1971, and he painted it red. And then for the 1972 season, it was painted a beautiful red, white and blue livery. Now Tope drove this car to victory in the very last race of the 1966-72 Trans Am era, which I think was quite fitting. When Tope switched to a big body Mustang, chassis 776 was sold to Bill Clausen and he raced it until 1975. Then it was put into storage until the early 1980s when it was bought by Richard Rodek, and he restored it back to its 1970 guise as driven by Vollmer. It's now owned by Ross Myers and it runs with the historic Trans Am Group. Now even though this was supposed to be the spare car for 1970, it ended up becoming Parnelli Jones's main car for much of the season. But unlike chassis 775 and 776, this one also saw action in 1969 in the last 2 races. Jones drove it at Sears Point and Riverside and he took pole position in both events. He was second at Sears Point, but he had a big dust-up with Mark Donoghue at Riverside. It was then updated as a 1970 model and painted grabber orange. And Jones drove it to 3 victories in 1970. It also won pole 5 times, including at Kent and Riverside at the end of the season, but weirdly, it didn't start either of these races. The team wanted Jones to run the fresher 775 chassis, which he agreed to, but he wanted to qualify 777. The chassis 777 was sold to Tony DiLorenzo for 1971, and it became part of the Troy Promotions team with Jerry Thompson. Now DiLorenzo and Thompson had previously run Chevy machinery and most notably A-production Corvettes. And DiLorenzo's dad was vice president for public relations at General Motors, so there was a strong GM link there. But the team built and raced second-gen Camaros in the 1970 Trans Am and it didn't go too well. So they switched to Mustangs for 1971 with a couple of former factory cars. 777 was sold to Vince Sandridge, who raced it until 1975 and then it was placed into storage. And then in the early 1980s, as interest in old Trans Am cars was growing, 777 was purchased by Dale Sale and returned back to its 1970 Bud Moore guys. Harry Lippitz bought the car in the mid-1990s and he restored it. It's been raced with the historic Trans Am Group for years, and even Parnelli Jones drove it on a couple of occasions. It's not currently active with HTA, but it is alive and well. Now if you're looking at old photos of this car, it differs to chassis 775 and 776 in that it had a black speckled interior, whereas the other 2 cars had a grey interior. And 775 and 776 also had a taller rear parcel shelf. And 777 had a different dash binnacle layout with the gauges sort of sprinkled around, whereas 775 and 776 had the gauges all in a row. Okay, as mentioned in the Anorak numbers that I did on these cars, there were 4 known bodies in white that were produced in late 1970. And these 4 bodies were stamped from lightweight sheet metal. And of all the factory Trans Am Mustangs, these were the only 1970 models. Remember 775, 776 and 777 all started life as 1969 models. Anyway, as mentioned earlier, Ford pulled funding for 1971, so BME had to go it alone as an independent. So Peter Gregg was signed on to drive the number 16 car, and he brought sponsorship from building company SS Jacobs. Now, even though these cars were also painted grabber orange, just like the 1970 cars, the easiest way to tell the difference is the SS Jacobs lettering above the Boss hockey stripe, and also the 1971 cars had the mini lights painted white. Now, because these were bodies in white, and they never had a factory VIN, they're referred to as 1 1971, 2 1971 and so on. And they're also referred to as body in white 1, body in white 2 and so on. And this was likely an after the fact method to easily label them in the absence of factory VIN numbers. This car was raced in the 1971 Trans Am by Peter Gregg. Greg's best race result was a second, and he also finished third a few times. He usually finished behind teammate Fulmer and Mark Donohue's Penske Racing Javelin, which was the only factory car left in the Trans Am by 1971. Because Budmore Engineering was running on a shoestring budget in 1971 and the team was based in South Carolina, they didn't travel to the West Coast races. In late 1971, this car was sold to Marshall Robbins. It was used as a spare, and then apparently in 1973 it was donated to Spangler Automotive Mechanic College. Now, Phil Bartelt bought the car in 1976 and he ran it in A sedan events and GT1, which is what A sedan became in 1980. He ran the car at the SCCA runoffs a few times as well. In 1982 it was purchased by Ed Lutke and he restored it back to its 1971 BME guise. It's since passed through various owners and is now with Ken Epsman and runs with the historic Trans Am group as the Peter Gregg car. This car made its race debut in round 8 at Saint-Jovite, driven by George Fulmer, and it replaced chassis 775. Fulmer also drove it at Watkins Glen and Michigan, which would be the last ever Trans Am race for Budmore Engineering. It finished second in all 3 outings and it qualified fastest at Watkins Glen. In late 1971 it was sold to Marshall Robbins along with one 1971, and he raced it in the 1972 and 73 Trans Am. In 1974 it was sold to Mike Lovejoy and he raced it until 1977 as an A sedan car before it was sold to Bob Bishop. Don Hodges bought it in the 1980s and restored it back to its 1971 BME Trans Am guise. It's gone through various owners since and is now owned by William Connor, who races it with the historic Trans Am group. Now this is a fascinating one. Bud Moore sold this car to Morris Davis in 1972 or 73 and it was fitted with a 351 motor. It was raced by Dan Doutry in the 1973 Paul Revere 250 at Daytona. This was a Camel GT IMSA race, hence the reason it had the bigger motor. Davis decided that IMSA prize money was a little too miserly, so he bought a NASCAR stock car from Bud Moore and sold the Mustang to Lem Kamek. He raced the car in IMSA and was joined by famed NASCAR driver Wendell Scott. Yes, that Wendell Scott. Now Scott raced the Mustang throughout 1975 and then retired it at the end of that year. And then it sat outside in his famed junkyard until it was purchased in 1984 by Mike Durran. Now he carried out most of the restoration but sold the car in 1988 to Mark Hereford. The restoration was then finished in 1971 Bud Moore livery. Now, did Bud Moore race this car in the 1971 Trans Am? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the subject of much debate. And the truth is, I'm not sure, sorry. It's said to have been built as a backup car in 1971 but never actually used. Now Mike Durran contacted Morris Davis in the 1980s and according to him and his mechanics, when they collected the car from Bud Moore, it had Peter Gregg lettering on it and number 16 roundels. And according to Mike, it also had damage repair beneath the grabber orange paint, which may have suggested it did see some action. Mike also asked Bud and Greg Moore and Ken Myler, who worked for Bud. And he said that they told him that all the cars were used. So, I can't really tell you much more than that. But regardless, this is a hugely significant car and linked to some of the biggest names of the era. Anyway, this car has passed through various owners over the years, including Ken Epsman and Jamie Mazzota. It then went to the Jim Click collection and is presented now in the number 16 Peter Gregg livery. Now this was the fourth body in white, but it was never actually built into a complete car by Budmore Engineering. It was eventually sold, but it remained incomplete until it was finally finished in 2011, overseen by Bud and Greg Moore. It's now finished in the 1971 Bud Moore livery, but without the SS Jacobs lettering. It's been bought and sold a few times over the years, and I believe it's also been vintage raced as well. And now for your bonus car. This was never actually a factory Trans Am race car. In fact, it never even raced in the Trans Am. But it was built entirely by Kar-Kraft engineers. You see, back in 1968, Penske Racing took one of their Camaros to the GM Proving Grounds, and the engineers there went over it with a fine-tooth comb. And from this, they created the Camaro Chassis Preparation Manual. Remember, the Trans Am only had a manufacturer's championship. So if some fast, independent Camaro drivers finished behind the factory Camaros, but ahead of the Fords, that was good for Chevrolet. So Chevrolet aided the independents with the Camaro Chassis Preparation Manual, which anyone could buy. And it detailed all the modifications they needed to make to their car as per their Penske car. And there also detailed part numbers for everything they needed, much of which could be purchased from a GM dealer. And as such, there were a bunch of fast independent Camaro teams in the 1969 Trans Am. So Ford did likewise in 1970, and Kar-Kraft built a complete 1970 Trans Am Mustang, and then detailed that car for what became the Boss 302 Chassis Modification Manual. Now interestingly, this car actually started life as a genuine 1970 Boss 302, unlike all the factory cars, and its VIN was OF02G137143. And the O at the start of the VIN, or 0, shows that this was a 1970 model. If that was a 69 model, the number would be a 9. And the fifth entry in the VIN is a G, which denotes this as a genuine Boss 302. Remember also that none of the factory Boss 302 Trans Am race cars were genuine Boss 302s. Now, this car didn't have the droop nose or the acid-dipped body of the factory race cars, and it was missing most of the fancy fabricated parts that the factory racers had. But all the detailed photos in that manual are of this car. Now, even though it didn't race in the Trans Am, it did race. In late 1970, it was raced in a few local SCCA events by Kar-Kraft engineers. And then when Ford pulled out, the Mustang was sold, and it went all the way to England, to Martin Bahrain. Bahrain raced it in the British Saloon Car Championship, which was run to FIA Group 2 regulations. And Group 2 allowed a few more freedoms than the Trans Am, including wider wheels and bigger engines. Bahrain raced the Mustang throughout the 1971 and 72 seasons, but unfortunately without too much success. And I think in 1972 he might have run a 351 motor. Now Bahrain himself went on to enjoy quite a lot of racing success in other cars and as a team owner, and he later became the owner of Lola Cars. Anyway, the Mustang passed through a few different owners, including Dave McCloy and Alvin Powell. In 1986, it was bought by Eric Walker, and he also owned the Dennis Leach Mustang and one of the old 1964 Holman Moody Monte Carlo Falcons. Eric sold the car in 1988 to David Tom in the US, and it was returned to the US and restored back as the Martin Bahrain Group 2 car. So, like I say, not a factory Trans Am car, but still one of interest and with a Kar-Kraft link. So there you have it, 17 cars, quite the fleet. When Ford went racing in this period, they did so on a grand scale and they really splashed the cash. And likewise, when they stopped, they just pulled the plug and the lights went out. I find these stories fascinating because if you'd gone to an SCCA event in the 1970s, you'd likely have seen an old factory Trans Am car there and not even known it. Most of them lived on with independent teams until the 1980s when interest in old Trans Am cars began to take off. And it's cool that several have survived and that their owners used them as Ford intended. Now I have to say a huge thanks to Wolfgang Korn, who has amassed an incredible archive of these cars. And not just the factory Trans Am Mustang race cars, but all the first gen Trans Am Mustang race cars, and in fact all the first gen Mustang race cars around the world. Now, I'll add a link below to Wolfgang's website, so please go and check it out. It truly is an amazing archive. Anyway, that's it for this episode, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for tuning in and watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and hit that little bell thingy so you'll get a notification when I post up a new video. So until next time, we will see you then. Cheers. Bye-bye now.
With the first lap complete, it's Mustang, Javelin, Barracuda, and Camaro in the first 4 positions.